Now that our form is all set up and working, we need to add some styles to make sure it's looking good on the page. Now the first thing I want to do is add a few tags that will help us not only with the formatting and layout, but also let us help connect together the form elements with the labels that tell my user what they're supposed to put in. If I go over and look at the code on our page so far, you can see that each one of my form elements has a label sitting in front of it, and that's just plain text right now. We can make that label functional by adding a label tag to it. I'll add one at the beginning and set up a close tag at the end of the label. Now that it has a tag, we can apply special formats to the labeled elements. But if we want to connect them to the actual input element they're set next to, each one of our input elements will need to have an ID. So I'll go down and add one to our first field here. I'll make it the same as the name, but I'll add a dash instead of the space like we had before. Now if I want to connect our label to it, I'll add in a for attribute. And we simply set that equal to whatever the ID of the input element is. Now we can add this to all of our labels in the form. I'll first go in and put a label tag in front of each one. And then I'll go back and close each one of the labels that we set up. Now, of course, each one is going to need its own ID value. So I'll set that up in the for attributes for each one first. And lastly, each one of our input elements needs to have a matching ID. So I'll set that up too. And of course, I'll make sure each one matches. Now let's save our change, and we'll go out and refresh the browser. You'll notice that the label field doesn't implicitly add any styles to it by itself. But now that each form element label has a tag, we can go and add some styles to it. So let's go back over to our document, and I'll go up to the style tag at the top. The first style rule I'll create uses label as the tag selector. I'll start off by doing a couple of things. First, I'll set the display to a block. And as we've seen before, that makes our element act like any other block inside the HTML page, allowing us to use some normal block properties. For instance, I could set a width of 200 pixels now. And just so that they stay on the left-hand side of each one of my form elements, I'll set them to float left too. I'd like the text to be right up next to the input field in each case, so I'll also add a text-align of right. And just so our form is spaced out a little bit better, I'll add some margins to it as well. I'll use the shorthand property, and I'll set a 10 pixel margin on the top and bottom, and a 5 pixel margin on the left and right sides. And finally, so that our labels and form elements stay in a nice stack, I'll also have them clear all the left floated elements. Let's see what that does so far. I'll save my change. We'll refresh our browser page. And now you can see my form has a little bit more style to it. The labels are all now neatly stacked up and spaced out, but you can see our form elements need a little bit of help too. So let's add some style rules for those. The first thing I want to do is take all of my input, select, and text area form elements and add some margins to them. So we'll create a combo style with all three selectors. And I'll set the same margins we did onto our labels. 10 pixels on the top and bottom, and 5 pixels on the left and right. Now we want them all to line up, so I'll use a vertical align of middle. Let's see what that does. I'll save my change, and we'll refresh our page. Now I've got almost everything spaced out correctly. The only thing I'm looking at here are my checkboxes and radio buttons aren't quite lined up with that middle alignment, and my send button is still hanging out over here on the side. Well, we can use a couple of classes to take care of that. First, I'll go to my form and add a couple classes in. I'll add one to all of my checkboxes and radio buttons, and I'll set the class to checks. And I'll just copy and paste that class into the other tags. Next, I'll go down to the Submit button down here at the bottom. Since we'll only have one Submit button, I'll make this one an ID instead. And I'll set it equal to Submit. Now we can go back up to our Styles tag and add a couple of rules. First, one for our Checks class. And for those, I'll just set a vertical align of bottom to move the text down in line with the other label. Now we can make one for the Submit ID. For this one, I'm going to push the Submit button over so that it matches the rest of the form elements. So I'll set a margin left of 200 pixels. And that way it'll match the amount the input items are moved over by the labels. Now let's save those changes. And when we go back out, we can see that all of our form now lines up. So now we can make a working and good functioning form and style it as well. In the next lesson, it's time to try out what we've learned in our website project.